Near the center of the Lynn Canal, just off the coast of Juneau, Alaska, a team of shipwreck hunters employ the latest sophisticated equipment to uncover the story of the most tragic shipwreck of the Pacific Northwest, the Princess Sophia. To this day, a debate rages. Were the hundreds of lives lost here the unavoidable consequence of a storm, or the inevitable cost of a captain's arrogance?
This story would be like any other tragic tale of the sea, except for a fateful decision made by Sophia's captain. What were the events of those last fateful hours? How could the captain's decision have been so wrong? Exploring Sophia's twisted remains will help answer these questions.
Join the Sea Hunters as they explore the final resting place of one of North America's most controversial sinkings, the Princess Sophia. With over 100 million books in print, Clive Cussler is the Grand Master of shipwreck tales and adventure. Director of the Vancouver Maritime Museum, James Delgado is one of the world's foremost marine archaeologists. With over 20 years diving experience, Mike Fletcher is an internationally renowned dive master. Leading the Econova dive team, John Davis has coordinated shipwreck searches around the globe. Together, they explore the planet's last frontier in search of true adventures, the famous shipwrecks. They are the Sea Hunters. Intrigued by shipwrecks whose stories have not been fully told, Sea Hunters Clive Cussler, John Davis, Mike Fletcher, and James Delgado endeavor to explore the last resting place of the Canadian Pacific liner Princess Sophia. Her loss in 1918 was the Pacific coast's worst maritime disaster, and yet she has largely been forgotten. This is a tale of a captain who rolled the dice against a stormy Alaskan sea and lost, taking his ship, his crew, and every one of his over 350 passengers to an early grave.
It's not an uncommon occurrence for a ship to run on the rocks. The hull's penetrated, the water goes to the stern, pulls it off, and it either sinks or floats away or whatever. We found that happening a lot of time in wrecks in the Civil War.
I wonder what was in the captain's mind. There he had a low in the weather. He had 6 or 7 rescue boats nearby, and he chose to send them away. What gave him that sense of confidence?
I think he was just relying on his technology and his hull.
Well, if he had no water coming in, he should have been, pretty firm in believing that he could get through this thing, because no water, his double hull, he figured when the tide comes in, he could float off or they could tow him off. So I could see why he was lulled in the complacency just by, everything that went along, because, you look at the waves here.
The team looks back on the puzzling chain of events that should have resulted in nothing more than a delay for Sophia's passengers, but instead would ultimately spell their doom. The Klondike Gold Rush of 1897 and smaller booms that followed enticed a flood of treasure seekers north to the Yukon and Alaska. During those years, the hardy coastal steamers of the Canadian Pacific Railroad and her competitors served as the only practical means of transportation in and out of the region. They sailed the Inside Passage along the stunningly beautiful shores of the Alaska Panhandle, carrying freight and passengers to and from the ports of Vancouver, Victoria, and Seattle. One section of that run was the Lynn Canal, a narrow fjord running 129 kilometers, or 80 miles, from Skagway in the north to Juneau at its mouth. It was here, in these waters, that a simple error in judgment led to heartbreak for the entire region. Here, after nearly 40 hours of helpless waiting for rescue, the passengers of the Princess Sophia slipped into a watery grave. 80 years have passed, And still the question echoes in the Alaskan wind. Could they have been saved? Sea Hunter Team leader John Davis and dive master Mike Fletcher fly to Juneau, Alaska. They intend to explore the reef and dive the wreck that lies beside it. They want to learn more about what happened during Sophia's last terrible moments. They fly through the coast ranges along the Alaskan seaboard. Landing at Juneau will put them about 48 kilometers or 30 miles from the site of the wreck. As they approach, they are taken by the wild, spectacular beauty of the mountains and the coastline. In the waning years of the 19th century, this area was populated mainly by the people of the Tlingit Nation. But all that changed in 1896, when gold was discovered in the Yukon's Bonanza Creek, and the last great gold rush began. Thousands came north in 1897 and 1898, hoping to strike it rich. Towns sprouted along the routes to the gold fields. Prospectors and adventurers came from every walk of life, drawn by the promise of instant wealth. Fortunes were made, mainly by those housing, provisioning, and transporting the gold seekers. But by 1918, gold fever had faded in the Northwest. Indeed, the region seemed to be sliding into hard times. Many of the young men had marched off to war, and the cash-strapped governments of Canada and the U.S. had turned a deaf ear to the residents and slashed services to the region. Optimism turned to despair, and many Northerners called it quits. October always saw increased traffic on the coastal boats. For many, autumn brought the annual ritual of closing up their homes before their winter migration south. But in 1918, the docks were jammed with crowds who had no intention of returning in the spring. They were desperate to book passage before the channel froze and locked them in for the long, dark winter. The Alaskan winter was not for the faint of heart. It could be harsh, even deadly. Once landed in Juneau, John and Mike check in with John Lachelt, owner of the Channel Dive Center. John will be the team safety diver and is more than familiar with the waters near the dive site. He has good suggestions for the approach the team should take.
Islands right in here, and actually if the weather gets really ugly, this is a great place to pull in and get out of the weather. So it's
a place to get out of the weather. There was no such sanctuary for Sophia as the bitter cold gales clawed her to her doom. That evening in the dive center's back room, the team prepares their equipment for tomorrow's dive. They plan to survey the wreck in search of the sections of her double hull that were damaged and which contributed to her sinking. James Delgado, the team's marine archaeologist, has joined Mike and John to inspect the wreck site. The team has adapted top-of-the-line equipment to meet the specific challenges of each dive. They know what they need to get from the dive and how best to achieve it. The small television camera and lights mounted on Mike's dive helmet would allow John and James to view the wreck on a television monitor stationed on the dive boat. With the lights, camera, and umbilical coupling, the helmet weighs a good 9 kilograms, or 20 pounds. It is awkward and heavy. Once immersed, its near-neutral buoyancy make it much less cumbersome. The helmet also allows for voice communication between Mike below and John and James above. The camera must be aligned so that Mike's line of sight is duplicated precisely on the monitor. Once the two are synchronized, Jim and John will see exactly what Mike sees.
There, that's looking straight.
The picture is sharp.
That's good.
And the audio clear.
Perfectly framed, isn't he?
Yes, he is. You
Okay,
got
I'm
me.
looking at Jim in his pink outfit.
That would be red.
That's red.
In an emergency, communication with the surface could be the difference between life and death.
2, 3, 4, 5.
Okay, that's good.
A few more adjustments, and they are ready for tomorrow's dive. The steamer Princess Sophia was purpose-built by the Canadian Pacific, specifically for this West Coast run. Designed to carry 1,500 tons of freight and as many as 500 passengers, her short, high-sided hull and three-tiered superstructure gave her a chubby, functional look. Though built as a coal burner, the company soon converted her to oil. Her boilers and single screw could drive her at speeds up to 14 knots. October 23rd, 1918, found Sophia in Skagway, preparing for the 2-day run to Vancouver. Her crew labored to secure 2 tons of luggage, furniture, and personal effects, as well as hundreds of Christmas parcels from the people of Dawson City, mostly for the troops on the Western Front. In the ship's safe and mailbags, several shipments of gold bullion were safely packed away. In the hold, 24 horses and 5 dogs shivered uneasily. Above deck, a crowd of passengers, 278 in all, surged up the gangway. Another 10 or more may have slept through the crowd without tickets, no doubt pleased with themselves for getting aboard for free. Sophia's passenger list included community and business leaders from across the region. Many were pioneers of the gold rush. 50 women and children were aboard, as was a contingent of young soldiers on their way to the trenches of France. Over 80 steamboatmen employed by the White Pass and Yukon Route Company took advantage of reduced rates to book passage home for the winter. They expected to return in the spring to their little white stern-wheelers, braving the shoals and rapids of the Great Broad River, which the Indians had named Yukon. As Sophia's crew were making their last-minute adjustments before leaving Skagway, her master, Captain Leonard Locke, kept an eye to the sky. Locke was a strict, solid captain who had served on ships around the world and had years of experience steaming along this coast. This was Sophia's last scheduled voyage of the season, and the demand for tickets had been brisk. Those who couldn't get tickets cursed their luck. They had no idea just how lucky they were. At last, at 10:10 p.m., 3 hours behind schedule, all berths occupied, and 353 souls aboard, the Princess Sophia slipped away from the dock. On the salon deck, the ship's orchestra played as the ice-coated mooring lines splashed into the sea. Early the next morning, the team boarded the Rainbird for the 4-hour cruise to the wreck site. The channel couldn't be more peaceful. Whitey Bloom is Rainbird's captain. He knows the story, and he knows how angry these gentle waters can turn when fall becomes winter. Mike and John recheck their tide tables. They have planned the dive to coincide with ebb tide. Arriving at the site at slack tide will give them some time to explore the reef. James Delgado wants to retrace the pattern in which Sophia swung and broke apart on the reef on the day she went to the bottom. As they make their way up the channel, they imagine Sophia as she steamed on her fateful voyage that late October night. Soon after Sophia left port, passengers who had been on deck bid a hasty retreat to their cabins to escape a bitterly cold wind. Within the hour, the weather had deteriorated. A blinding snowstorm, driven by a freezing north wind, descended on the ship. The sea turned rough and visibility shrank to zero. Captain Locke had sailed Sophia under such conditions many times before. and he had a schedule to keep. So he ordered that Princess Sophia maintain full speed as she steamed blind into the storm. Below decks, the passengers were warm and comfortable. According to the Journal of the Puget Sound Historical Society,
Princess Sophia was attractive to passengers. Many people sailing to and from the north preferred to sail on her. She had comfortable public rooms, hot and cold running water, nice staterooms, courteous stewards, that renowned Canadian Pacific cuisine, and by Alaskan standards, she was luxurious.
As the night wore on, the conditions worsened. Cruising through the whiteout at top speed, Captain Locke's bad weather navigation was a matter of best guesses. Like many other sailors, Locke navigated this channel with compass headings and by periodically sounding the ship's whistle to gauge the echo from shore. At the point where the shipping lane narrowed to 4 kilometers, or 2.5 miles, sat half an acre of rock, barely covered by the choppy seas. Vanderbilt Reef. Deep water ran around it on all sides. Only an unlighted can buoy south of the pinnacle warned of the hazard. In the days before radar, such a marker on such a night was pretty much no marker at all, especially for a vessel heading south at breakneck speed. The 4-hour journey up the Lynn Canal is like a Sunday drive. The sea is calm, the team is relaxed, and the visibility is unlimited. Captain Bloom is an endless source of local lore and stories. It's difficult to imagine the tension that Locke must have felt as he navigated these waters on that night. Captain Locke's navigation techniques had served him well enough for years. This night, though, best guesses were nowhere near good enough. At 2:10 a.m., disaster. The shock threw passengers from their beds. Crew members were hurled against bulkheads and furniture, and crockery crashed to the deck. The engine throbbed for a few moments more, then silence, broken only by the groans of passengers and crew as they checked for broken bones. Shock became terror as the groaning of the hull scraping the rock echoed through the ship. But there was no torrent of water, no pitching of the decks. Sophia was not sinking. Gradually, passengers and crew realized that she was perched upon the reef, her hull partially afloat in the shallow water. Not sunk, just stranded. Sophia could not shift off the rock under her own power.
Welcome to Vanderbilt Reef. You know what's amazing, Mike? What we're able to do today, 300 odd people couldn't do back in 1918. I mean, look at how calm these seas are. These would have been the teeth of death.
Did you find evidence of the wreck, Jim?
Yeah, there's some metal, and it looks almost like a trench has been dug right through here. My guess is that we're looking right at where Sophia came in. Come ashore.
The reef at low tide, with its jagged rocks, is inviting. Mike and James will have time to explore small tidal pools and look for evidence of how the reef engaged the ship.
You see how that's just through there and it's almost like it's worn? I mean, it's almost like a trench that's been cut right through here. And you see that? I mean,
where did you find the iron?
The metal is right over here. It's right in this pool. But look right in here. See, there's fragments of metal. Yeah, look at that. See, this has been here for some time. It's a thicker plating. I think what we're looking at, this and then this other stuff is still adhering to the rocks.
Like you can't pry it loose?
No, you can't pry it loose. My sense is we're looking at broken pieces of Sophia's hull that are just caught on the reef. Rainbird, this is shore party, over.
This is Rainbird, over.
John, we're right here on top of the reef, and we've got some tide pools with metal that looks like it comes from Sophia. It looks like metal that's been torn and ground up, which is exactly what you would expect with a ship of that size sitting on this reef.
Well, that's a great story. Can you see the direction of drag and get some sense of how much of the bottom was torn out of that wreck when she spun off that reef, over?
Well, we've got pretty small pieces of metal, which indicates to me a lot of tearing and dragging, John. And given the way that this wind is going right now, I could see her just working on this reef with these jagged teeth. It's almost like a huge, it's not a huge mass of rock, it's pieces of rock, like teeth, and I could just see them chewing into this hull.
Well, that would certainly begin to explain why she sat there for so long and then so quickly went to the bottom. If she made one large arc over and started to spin her stern out to the westward, she certainly would have chewed up a lot of bottom and would have gone through that double hull without much trouble, over.
Yeah, I agree. Now the tide's coming in, so we're not able to look much further, but my guess is that this reef is going to be covered with little pieces of metal like this.
I really believe that you're telling a good part of the story right now, over.
Yeah, my guess is, Mike, that she drove right on in like this, and she's hung up here with the bow, maybe about where we are, maybe a little bit further on, maybe even farther. And then sometime, you know, just at the very end, ground and ripped, she comes off and she swings around.
What's that north wind driving her this way?
Just pushing her around and swinging her off so that she goes like this and swings, and you can see right over there, right by the Rainbird, which is practically where the stern of Sophia is now, how she just came around practically 180 degrees. To come in like that, I mean, her bow is practically directly offshore of us, and then there's that red buoy. I mean, she's pointing directly at us right now.
Right.
And for her to go from this to that, she'd go to the bottom instantly. I mean, she'd sink so fast. With this kind of damage that we're seeing here, with this metal on this reef, they didn't have a chance.
Not knowing his imminent danger, Locke reported the mishap by wireless to the CPR office in Juneau. The news landed like a bomb. Immediately, despite the early hour, the local ticket agent began a rescue operation. There being no vessel large enough to take off all the passengers of Princess Sophia, he was forced to round up as many smaller vessels as he could. Passenger and freight ships, mail and fishing boats responded to the call and set off for Vanderbilt Reef. Juneau wired Sophia. Help was on the way. At 9 a.m., the first of the rescue vessels, the U.S. Army vessel Peterson, appeared out of the swirling snow. Her crew could see Sophia's passengers looking unconcerned as they strolled the deck. Convinced that rescue was at hand, some had brought suitcases above and waited patiently. They watched as Sophia's lifeboats were swung out in preparation for abandonment. Land was close, less than 5 kilometers, or 3 miles, to the east, and just over 6 kilometers, or 4 miles, to the west. Most on board seemed to share the captain's cool confidence that there was nothing to fear. Only a few wrestled with premonitions of approaching doom. There is no doubt that Leonard Locke was in a very difficult situation. The jagged rocks and rough water surrounding the Sophia meant that any lifeboats leaving or approaching the vessel would be in grave danger. So, calling upon his decades of experience, he made a fateful decision. He was convinced that his ship was secure on the reef, so he opted to wait for the winds to drop so that he could transfer his passengers to the larger Canadian Pacific vessels that he knew were on their way.
The 66-year-old captain had faith in Princess Sophia's double hull, so he declined assistance from the small boats that raced to the scene to remove passengers from the stricken ship. Groundings were common in those days, and Sophia had grounded at least twice before, and each time she had survived. Even the passengers didn't question the captain's decision. After the collision with the reef, passengers strolled the decks, seemingly unconcerned, leaning on the rails to watch the boats gathering nearby. Little did they know that the captain's decision had sealed the fate of all on board.
Here, Mike, is the position of the Sophia as she came down and hit the reef. What we know now is that she's gone down around on to the western side of the reef and tipped to her starboard side. You've got your...
Back aboard the Rainbird, John and James review the specifics of the dive plan with Mike.
Mike, a couple of things that we're not quite clear on yet that we're going to have to sort out is just how much she pivoted. There's some indication...
They will be looking for the double hull features in which Captain Locke had put so much faith.
Obviously, a couple of things that we're going to be looking for down there are, particularly on the bottom around the keel, is some evidence of the damage to the hull. There's some supposition that as this thing twisted and tore, that she ripped her bottom out, and that would explain the rapid sinking process.
At this point, the double hull was still holding, but tension was rising aboard Sophia. The rescue vessels pitching just out of reach in the crashing seas now inspired more frustration than confidence. Locke directed the crew to pass out life jackets and drill the passengers in rescue procedures. It was his intention to attempt evacuation at the next high tide at 5 a.m. Removing 350 people from a stranded vessel was a risky venture in the best of circumstances. Never mind in the total darkness of an early wintry morning. Everyone had to be ready. But once again, they found themselves in a prison of wind. The northern gale continued to rise, dashing tremendous breakers against the stranded vessel. Shouting above the roaring sea through megaphones, Locke and the other captains all agreed that launching the lifeboats would be suicide. The passengers would be safer waiting aboard Sophia. Once more, the passengers had to swallow their fear and wait.
Owing to the storm, the boats were not lowered. This morning we are surrounded by a number of small boats, but it is too rough to transfer the passengers. In the realism that we are surrounded by grave danger, I make this my last will.
After some final preparation, Mike is ready to dive. The water is just above freezing. Slowly, he descends to the stricken wreck.
Downline.
We can see the downline clearly.
Roger, light to the camera.
Flag the diver.
There below is a large mass of wreckage that once was the Princess Sophia. It is encrusted with white sea anemones.
On bottom.
Roger, diver on bottom.
And what's the diver's pressure?
I've got you at just about 100 feet, and I've got you at about 2,900 pounds PSI.
Oh, Roger. Okay, Jim, there's the steering wheel.
Mike, that's the stern wheel. I can't believe it.
But it's definitely the steering wheel, whether it's the auxiliary wheel off the stern or possibly the one from the wheelhouse. It's not where it should be, that's for sure.
I would agree. It's hard to say. There's so much damage to the superstructure that this could be some shifted debris from the wheelhouse.
Eventually I'll try and make my way around so we can get good images of where the wreck contacted the bottom, exactly where the hull was in contact with the reef.
Okay, yeah, I've got you coming right up to a hatchway of some sort, an entrance I can see down inside.
Mike has found a large hole in the side of the wreck.
Okay, do you have any idea where that would be on the ship?
I get the sense that we're somewhere around amidships, maybe moving aft, Mike.
I'll try and get in a little closer and see what we can see here.
Standing by.
Mike decides to enter the wreck. Inside, there is a much greater danger of entangling the umbilical. Mike knows the risks. Weighing the risks was foremost on Leonard Locke's mind. By noon, the wind, already blowing a full gale, unbelievably blew harder. Locke and rescuers remained convinced that the reef was firmly supporting the vessel, and that the right course of action was to wait out the storm. The rescue vessels raced off for shelter. Throughout the afternoon, the captains of the rescue vessels sat aboard Cedar, making plans for the rescue. Then at 4:50, the Cedar's wireless began to clatter. Ship foundering on reef, come at once. A frantic cry for help, soon followed by another. For God's sake, hurry! The water is coming in my room.
What do you make of that?
Well, it looks like you've popped your way into the hull, and I'm seeing more clear indication we're on our side. Bulkheads have given way, but there's fixtures here. It's pretty clear we're inside the wreck now, and you didn't have to go through a small hole, did you?
No, it's typical what's down here.
Something that looks like a stanchion of some sort there? What is that?
It's my feeling that this is part of a brass handrail.
Yeah, roger that. I see that. That's exactly what it is. Oh, Mike, are those shoes? Look at that. He's got the soles of shoes.
Well, just the sole of one. Definitely a shoe.
The sole of a shoe, a grim reminder of one of the over 350 people who lost their lives here.
Okay, now, yeah, good. That's a toilet in there. Okay, you've come back to that area.
Mike attempts to identify his position on the wreck. Knowing this will help the team calculate his proximity to sections of the double hull.
I don't think, no, it's not the same washroom even.
Mike, you clearly found that site, which is just, from the looks of the plans here, it is just aft of a midship. Mike, in the area that you're in now, there seem to be quite a number of plates which look as if you're we're looking at a flattened area of hull. Can you identify whether or not that's what we're looking at?
It really is difficult to make sense of just how it's connected or making contact with the bottom there. I'll just explore around the ship a bit.
Roger that, I understand. Why don't you head up towards that engine room area?
Mike attempts to identify his position on the wreck. Knowing this will help the team calculate his proximity to sections of the double hull.
We'll head towards the boilers.
These cranks look big, Mike. I mean, I think, yeah, I see what you're talking about as a generator, but I'm seeing main steam pipes. I'm seeing back up there. Yeah, look right there. See that big crank? You are in the engineering space. You're in the engine room.
I don't question that for a minute.
There are, you can see areas of the turn of the bilge, and you can see...
Finally, the team locates a large section of the double hull. Here they see that both the inner and outer sections have sustained massive damage. It was here at the inner section of the double hull where the captain's hope of rescue was betrayed. When the Sophia struck the reef, the outer hull was punctured and water slowly began to penetrate the ship. As the forces of wind and waves propelled the ship around almost 180 degrees, it is thought that the inner hull was then ripped open like a tin can, allowing a floodgate of water to enter, dashing any hope for Sophia's survival. With water now rushing into the ship, the crew frantically launched the lifeboats, but each was flipped over or clawed under by the towering waves. Then slowly, with a rending and screeching of steel against rock, Sophia slipped backwards off the reef. The boilers, suddenly flooded with icy water, erupted in a massive explosion which ripped throughout the lower decks. Bleeding thousands of liters of oil, Princess Sophia gave up to the dark breakers she had battled so bravely. The after section filled with water and settled deeper, dragging the forepart off the clawing rocks and into the sea. 3 stories above the deck, the wireless operator tapped out his final frantic wireless message. He remained at his post until the oily darkness burst through his door. Over 350 souls, men, women, and children, disappeared into the icy Black Sea, taking with them their expectations of a sunny winter far from the Alaskan snow, and leaving nothing behind but the howling, mocking wind.
Mike, if you can work your way outside the hull now, we'd like to see you try to trace and move forward.
Okay, Jim, that's not a problem. Up my hose.
Roger that, up your hose.
Okay, I'm moving outside the ship.
Now knowing where the damaged section of the double hull is from the inside, Mike makes his way to the same section of the vessel to examine the exterior.
I'll go to bottom.
Mike is looking for evidence of the tearing process that would have ripped the hull to shreds.
Okay, you can see I'm actually trying to make my way right up underneath the hull.
Mike, it looks like you're right at the turn of the bilge on what would be the port side, and that she is on her starboard side, over.
That certainly is my impression, John.
I must be very, very close to the stern here.
Okay, Mike, I see you there. You're at the stern now. We're showing you depth at 140. That's a propeller blade, isn't it?
Yeah, definitely, Jim. Right here, you know, at a glance, you wouldn't even recognize it. There's just the one bucket sticking out of the bottom here.
Are there segments of the keel available to you visually anywhere, Mike? Over.
Well, let's see if we can get to them. Maybe we're going to see it on the port side.
Mike, just go a little bit to the left.
Finally, the team has found what they've been looking for. Strong evidence that Sophia was violently torn from the reef.
Bingo, right there. Yeah, Mike, you see that girder, the way that's twisted, that hull plating. That kind of force, I don't think that we're seeing something that happened in years since she's been on the reef. That looks like it was sinking damage.
If that is hull plate, what we have is clearly a substantial amount of trauma to the hull in that particular area.
It's so badly broken. But I do get the impression that the ship is shifted towards, so that the stern is swinging towards the south. And as it did, you can see some of the metal has been pulled that way, as if it's pulled back to the starboard, which would indicate that the stern would have swung to the south.
Well, I agree, I concur. I'm seeing clear evidence that this thing has ground into the reef, and she has certainly twisted and pulled.
Okay, if we could do a pneumo there, water depth.
When Cedar was finally able to fight her way to the channel, her captain and his crew were horrified at what they saw. Vanderbilt Reef was bare. The brave ship had vanished, except for the top few feet of a mast jutting from the waves, the grave marker of Princess Sophia. Immediately, the rescue flotilla began searching for survivors. 3 hours of searching through the snowstorm turned up nothing. Then at last, an overturned lifeboat was spotted on an island shore. Nearby, the first body was discovered. Others soon appeared, and it became chillingly clear that there would be no survivors. Their job became a search for the dead. 180 bodies were recovered, all coated in thick black oil. Over 350 men, women, and children died, as well as 24 horses. The only survivor was a frightened, oil-covered English setter. Shock waves from the disaster reverberated throughout the entire Northwest. 1 in 10 of the citizens of the town of Dawson perished. The White Pass and Yukon route lost over 80 of their employees. Businessmen, community figures, planners, and personalities. They all died at once, with no one left behind to take their place or to build their memorials. Soon after the disaster, divers engaged by the CPR spent a frigid 4 hours searching the wreck. They recovered a safe and 1 body. Over the following months, the divers recovered another 86 bodies. Less than 3 weeks after Sophia's demise, the CPR steamer Princess Alice arrived in Vancouver, carrying 156 bodies from Juneau to their gathered families and loved ones. The Ship of Sorrow, as the press had dubbed it, arrived to find the city streets filled with ecstatic crowds. In another terrible irony, the bodies had arrived on November 11th, Armistice Day. The war was over. And so the crew of Alice and the families of the victims carried out their tragic task in the midst of the largest celebration in the city's history. After decompressing on the line for 30 minutes, it's time for Mike to surface. The dive has been a successful one. The team has found evidence of the ship's torn hull plates, which tells the full tale of what caused Sophia's fatal tragedy.
Just looking for the reef. There it is. Imagine being a survivor here swimming. This is what you would have seen if it had been daylight.
It's a horrific thought, that cold water and bobbing in the same spot.
Yeah.
To this day, the sense of needless, avoidable tragedy remains. Did they have to die? To many at the time, it certainly seemed odd. The general public's impression of the disaster was simply that Sophia had run aground as a result of steaming full head down the channel during a full-blown blizzard. And even though many vessels came for her rescue, their assistance was declined, as the company preferred the captain to wait for its own vessel's arrival.
He should have took them off. There was lots of time. The waves weren't that big. They all didn't have to die.
The subsequent inquiry into the accident heard wild accusations against Locke. Juneau resident Paul Graham, who had crewed aboard one of the rescue boats, testified that,
"I believe I could have taken them off in a rowboat. We were told that if the rescue boats had been Canadian or British, they would have been allowed to take passengers. But they were American, and that settled it for Captain Locke."
Why didn't you take them off. Order in this court.
Captain Davis of the Estebeth testified,
You could have operated between the Princess Sophia and the Estebeth in a Peterborough canoe.
Order. Order in this court.
When asked his opinion of Locke running Sophia full speed in a snowstorm, the Marine Superintendent of the BC Coastal Service answered in one word: unwise. The inquiry finally concluded that the Princess Sophia was lost through peril of the seas. Further, the board found that it was not unreasonable for Captain Locke to have chosen not to land his passengers.
In the end, the captain was excused, but the CPR immediately changed its rules. In the event that a ship was grounded, no matter what, the passengers had to be taken off for their safety. The Sophia tragedy certainly underscored the need for changes in marine safety regulations and procedures. And as a result, who knows how many lives have been saved. As to whether the lives aboard Sophia could have been saved, we'll never know. The best we can do is pay tribute to the more than 350 people who lost their lives, and to remember the events on that reef on that dark, terrible, stormy night in late October 1918.
A few weeks after the sinking, a lighted buoy was installed on Vanderbilt Reef by the Alaskan government. In 1921, it was replaced by a light on an 11-meter or 36-foot steel tower. The tower still stands today, a constant reminder of a tragic afternoon in 1918 when a princess went to her grave. Join us again as we search the oceans of the world for lost and famous shipwrecks. Another true adventure with the Sea Hunters.
Now it's your turn to get up off that couch and go into the deserts, go into the mountains, go into the rivers, the lakes, and the seas, and search for history. You'll never find a more rewarding adventure.